So this is the outline for my talk today. I'm going to start with kind of setting the scene of English only in the world today, and I'm going to show how the prevalence of English only policies and de facto practices in ELT are creating disastrous problems. And then I'm going to introduce the focus, or the main idea of my presentation today. That is the importance of adopting a translanguaging lens in ELT, especially in ELF-aware pedagogy, both in classes that are like in the ENRICH projects and the classes that I've seen the presentations of in this conference, classes that are multilingual with multilingual students, but also in classrooms that are, and I put it in inverted commas, homogeneous, or typically homogeneous classrooms where our students come from the same sort of L1 or cultural background. And I'm going to show, or at least discuss, why this is important. I'm also going to talk a little bit more in detail into what a translanguaging lens is and what it means. I have adopted the term translanguaging lens from Ofelia Garcia and her work in translanguaging. And I'm going to show how, from my perspective, it's important to adopt a translanguaging lens in ELF-aware pedagogy. And then I'm going to look at some suggestions, and the suggestions are not necessarily from me, but I gathered from colleagues around the world that have looked at how to develop a translanguaging lens, whether explicitly or implicitly in the way that they carry out their classroom practices. And then I will end by proposing to adopt a translanguaging lens in ELF-aware pedagogy and showing how this fits well within a broader social justice perspective. So, to get started, setting the scene, really, it's important. Although we discuss in this conference we discuss multilingual practices and in some cases some multilingual policies around the world. However, we have to recognize that English-only policies and de facto practices are very common and more common than multilingual ones around the world. The ubiquity of English only is both geographical, in the sense that policies and practices that enforce English only in the classroom or in institutions, pedagogical institutions around the world, have been developed in Asia, in Africa where even in those countries where French was more relevant, English is taking over even there. In South America, and I think to a certain extent even in Europe, although the situation in Europe, I believe, is deceptively better because of the plurilingual European policies, but I feel that might be different from a translanguaging perspective, and I hope I will show it later. But it's also, the ubiquity of English is obvious also from the pedagogy at different levels, from higher education, where EMI seems to be imposed as English only around the world, but also down to very early starters of learning English. Young learners around the world are exposed to classes that are more and more English only. So in this kind of setting, I think the consequences from these de facto language policies and practices that emphasize the presence of only English in the classroom are disastrous, because they reinforce inequalities at various levels. They reinforce monolingual bias, whereby our students are constantly measured against the competence of monolingual native speakers. They reinforce a native speaker ideology. But they also, unfortunately, put in danger the well-being of teachers that have become quite anxious about including the L1 of their students in the classroom. And we often hear of the guilty feelings that the teachers talk about when they use their L1 in the classroom. I also think the consequences are disastrous, because there are so many missed opportunities in the classroom by using English only. But also, finally, and this is a little bit more what I mean by translanguaging perspective, there's the reinforcement of a hierarchical knowledge system, whereby English only knowledges and practices are the ones that are valued rather than other epistemic understandings. So monolingual pedagogical principles also, I know that I'm talking kind of to an audience possibly that understands this already, but this is not the situation around the world. But also these monolingual pedagogical principles are also not supported from an empirical evidence. They're not necessary, they're not effective when we look at them from an empirical evidence. So what I think we need to be doing is trying to adopt a translanguaging lens. And what I mean by a translanguaging lens, let me first talk about translanguaging very briefly. There were a lot of presentations today about translanguaging, and I think it's a topic that is already familiar to a lot of people here. But just briefly, translanguaging is both a theory and a pedagogy. In terms of theory, it shows that users of languages, learners as well, do not rely on separate language systems, one for each language they know, but they actually deploy their resources from a unitary repertoire, whereby they make meaning in communication relying on these resources. So in this sense, translanguaging is not about counting different languages and different systems, but it's also a pedagogy. It's a pedagogy in the sense that it leverages, it relies on learners' diverse linguistic practices in teaching and in learning. So translanguaging challenges both the monolingual approach to language teaching, but also the plurilingual approach. Plurilingual as in separate languages, countable language systems. And it builds on contemporary perspectives on diversity. The idea that linguistic and cultural diversity are assets, are resources in language learning and teaching. And these are ideas that have been shared by Ofelia Garcia, as I've already mentioned, Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei in their monograph, Translanguaging, but also in terms of pedagogical translanguaging by Jasone Senos and Ducote, and also still in a pedagogical perspective, Jean Conte. And you can... And these, I feel, are people who have already developed these ideas in detail. So I don't want to reiterate even more. I would like to move on and to explore what adopting a translanguaging lens in ELF-aware pedagogy means. For me, adopting a translanguaging lens means that and these are the aspects that I feel to a certain extent we are already doing, challenging native speakerism and monolingualism, enhancing cultural linguistic diversity, empowering teachers, especially in making them feel that they can use different languages apart from English in the classroom, and leveraging our learners' multilingualism, even in classes that are so-called homogeneous classes, where our learners come from the same linguistic background. But also making languages other than English more visible in these classes. And this is, I feel, to a certain extent, we already do with ELF-aware pedagogy, and certainly was quite obvious and prevalent in the ENRICH project and the presentation so far. What I feel maybe we can still develop from a translanguaging lens is developing a decolonial mindset and reject abyssal thinking. And what I'm going to do in the next slides is talk about this. So first of all, very briefly, we already started challenging native speakerism, and this, I think, has already achieved quite a lot since Harry Witterson's seminal paper in 1994 about the ownership of English. In 2021, Lowe and Kiskowiak already talked about tackling native speakerism through ELF-aware pedagogy. However, there's a lot that still remains to be done in materials, in terms of discrimination, in recruitment in ELT, where native speakers are still prevalent. And this is actually an example on the right-hand side, Falarsem Sotake from Savio Siqueira. He sent me this example from social media yesterday. He found in his social media channels. And this means how to reduce the Brazilian. This was an advert for reducing Brazilian accent and a private school that helped you do that. So there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of this kind of discrimination. But even big publishing houses have already addressed this problem since the phonology of English as an international language, where Jenny Jenkins looked at the core for phonology. Robin Walker published the OUP position paper, which is available to all teachers around the world, emphasizing how teachers nowadays should make use of the L1 accent in their classroom, should build on the learner's L1 background to teach pronunciation. They should also focus on accommodation and intelligibility rather than native speaker norms. And this, for me, puts at the core, at the center, respect for different accents, but also the right to having a different accent in ELT. In terms of enhancing linguistic and cultural diversity, this is another aspect of a translanguaging lens. And I think we've already done quite a lot of work in ELF-aware pedagogy, but also theoretically and practically. From a theoretical perspective, we've already researched the diversity of English and the diversity of ELF from a corpora perspective. We've included a multilingual perspective in the work by Jenkins, who's put forward or has emphasized the importance of English as a multilingual franca. In terms of different levels of work, lexicography, pronunciation, and pragmatics, and in terms of intercultural and transcultural awareness. So a lot of work has already been done. And in terms of pedagogy, the shift from teaching linguistic features to enhancing linguistic and cultural diversity by exploiting the learners' resources in our classrooms is already happening, and it's in progress. But I particularly like and emphasize the idea of the colonial perspective, which I think we need a little bit more work on. And I liked a lot the paper by, again, Savio Siqueira in the special issue on ELF and language teaching, edited by Yasmin Bayurt and Martin Dewey, who emphasize at the colonial ELT, how we can decolonize ELT through ELF awareness and ELF awareness activities. And the ENRICH Project has also showed quite a lot of this kind of multilingual perspective in ELF awareness. So as I said, the lingua franca or the multilingual perspective, a lot of work has already been done in challenging multilingualism and enhancing diversity. I feel there's a lot that still needs to be done, or a little bit more work needs to be done, at least to develop a decolonized mindset. And here is the part, I think, where we need a little bit more work towards adopting a translanguaging lens for ELF-aware pedagogy. And I think this is the kind of decolonizing perspective that links quite well with what Thelma Jimenez this morning was talking about as the political ELF awareness. The awareness of English and the position of English in the world, and how English could reinforce colonial practices, but at the same time also possibly adopt a decolonizing perspective through ELF. So if we take translanguaging lens, it's not so much about including different linguistic resources in the classroom, which I feel already the ENRICH Project has shown that we can do in a successful way, but it's about the colonizing perspective. Translanguaging is there in classrooms, possibly that are all homogeneous. And here I find that teachers sometimes, when they have students from the same L1 background, they tend to especially at a more advanced level, to focus on English only and do not include any knowledges or perspectives that are not shared by English in English. And I find that this is the problem, because translanguaging perspective can be there even in homogeneous classrooms. As Panico was saying, language is always in translation, and however, despite this, ELT is still often a monolingual industry. And it's important from a translanguaging perspective to resist this linguistic stratification and colonial discourses. And I was saying that apart from the decolonial perspective, adopting a translanguaging lens means resisting abyssal thinking. Abyssal thinking is the term that has been used by Garcia, Liwei, Otegui, and others in a manifesto about this topic, whereby abyssal thinking is the kind of thinking that puts at the center English-only knowledges and perspectives. And so it's the hegemonic kind of thinking, which erases the existence of other knowledges, other perspectives. So through a translanguaging lens, we can challenge abyssal thinking. We can challenge the knowledges and practices of white monolingual people as the only relevant ones. So the idea is to challenge the position of the native speaker as the center position, but the position of the English white native speaker as the most important one. It's about cognitive justice and epistemic diversity, and it's also about challenging monocultures of knowledge and including knowledges coming from other backgrounds, non-English backgrounds, as important knowledges. And here I'm not only thinking about knowledges coming from other languages, I'm thinking about knowledges coming from languages that are sometimes not considered non-dominant, considered as ethnic minority languages, the languages maybe of the refugees and asylum seekers rather than the elitist languages of European multilingualism. I find that by adopting a translanguaging lens in ELF-aware pedagogy, we can resist this kind of abyssal thinking in English, recognize that ELT is a political activity, and as again Savio Siqueira says, English can serve to, of course, entrench injustice and exploitation, but we can also use it to fight against such injustices and such practices. I think maybe this is not the conference where such opposition may start, but people outside an ELF-aware conference will probably object to this, saying that by framing ELF as coming out of discourses of this kind, ELF comes out of discourses of global Englishes and as a depoliticized medium. As a medium that is not concerned with colonial and racialized discourses. I feel this is not the case. And if we adopt a translanguaging lens, we can emphasize our position as resistance to abyssal thinking. So by proposing this kind of lens, I challenge this kind of thinking, and I place this discussion in a broader social justice frame, a frame that also ELF-aware pedagogy, as I understand it, is placed within a frame of critical language education and critical language pedagogy, and a frame of critical anti-racist pedagogy. It's the kind of critical applied linguistics that I feel people in ELF-aware pedagogy have been discussing and drawing upon. So a translanguaging lens would enable us to activate this social justice frame as well. So this is the kind of description of what a translanguaging lens means for me, and especially in ELF-aware pedagogy. And now I think I will give you some examples, limited. I agree, this is, I don't have enough time to show how other colleagues have approached this, where people have possibly drawn on non-English understandings, knowledges, and practices for ELF-aware pedagogy, whether explicitly addressing them as translanguaging lens or decolonial practices or not. I find that a lot has already been done in the ENRICH handbook. I was particularly pleased to read a lot of examples that builds on pedagogical translanguaging and raising multicultural awareness, and also referring to refugee languages and background and how to leverage this kind of understanding in the classroom. There's a lot of reflection on multilingual activities, both in the ENRICH handbook and in general in practices of ELF-aware pedagogy. For instance, activities that draw on the individual repertoire and the language biographies or portraits of our students that raise awareness of diversity, but also different kinds of knowledges and resist this monoculture of knowledges. Also activities that look at linguistic landscape, that encourage the students to develop a critical understanding of how meaning, culture, or power work happens in their context, like encouraging students to take pictures of English mixed with other languages or other languages in their cities, in their context. But also a re-evaluation of translation activities, translation which in a grammar translation ELT perspective was criticized heavily in the past, can still be used in terms of reintroducing ideas from other language backgrounds that might be untranslatable in English and or that in other languages might expand our knowledge and our understanding of that concept. I think all these activities have potential for a translanguaging lens. Other activities are the ones that have been discussed also in this conference about normalizing ELF input or ELF competence. We all know, at least here, the benefit of including effective ELF input in our classes. The students have the opportunity to expand linguistic diversity, to kind of achieve some kind of comfortable intelligibility, become aware of diversity and communicative strategies, but also reflect on multilingual resources. And multilingual resources that might be obvious, overt in communication, that they might bring in as other languages, or they might be covert, that might be in the understanding of our students, in the understanding behind, in the schema behind what we read or what we watch in the language classroom. So there's here as well potential for a translanguaging lens. In conclusion, I may have been running a little bit because I haven't seen Lily telling me it's 10 minutes to go. But I hope it wasn't too rushed.
You still have, just so to let you know, you have at least 6 to 8 minutes that you can use. All right, Alessia?
Okay, all right. That's great. So these are the last 2 slides. So if we adopt a translanguaging lens, it's not only about decentering English by including more multilingual resources, which is what a lot of us are already doing. And I think it's something that is particularly common in European context, where we have multilingualism, a lot of multilingual students in the classroom. But it's not only about that. It's not about including more multilingual resources in the classroom, but it's also about decolonizing our students' mind, helping our students to critically reflect on the role of English today and how English could be reproducing colonial understanding of the world. So to conclude, I think I would encourage adopting a translanguaging lens in ELF-aware pedagogy in an effort to develop a more decolonial, non-Eurocentric linguistic practices and knowledge construction, and also in combination with more action-oriented classroom practices for linguistic diversity within a social justice frame. And that's all from me. Thank you, everyone.